Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the IGNA Endorse Webmaster Series. We have stepped into the 11th webinar and we have successfully completed all 10 webinars. Today, we have a topic on pertinent to neonatal nephrology, and the next two webinars also will be all about neonatal nephrology. We have three topics to be covered for the day by Dr. Ishwar Raja, Dr. Mani Kumar, and Dr. Shobna. They'll be talking on estimation of GFR food therapy in neonates. Is it different? And the other topic is neonatal hypertension. And I call upon Dr. Ishwar Raja, who is the chairperson for the day, to introduce the speakers.
Good evening, one and all. I'm very happy to be part of this International Pediatric Nephrology Association Webmaster Series 11. I'm very happy for that. I thank the organizers, Dr. Nammalwar and Dr. Kalevani. And it's a great pleasure to be a part of this and contribute whatever good neonatal work towards this. First, we are two dynamic speakers. One is Dr. Shobana, a well-known colleague of mine, and Dr. Mani Kumar. So the first speaker will be Dr. Shobana, and she's a dynamic person, always active, very avid lover of doing neonatology innovations. And she's specialized, particularly she's interested in ROP and even preterm nutrition. So I wouldn't stand, and she's a gold medalist also. So let's hear first Dr. Shobana. Yeah. So she'll be talking on estimation of GFR in neonates. Is that reliable?
Good evening. Thank you for the organizers for this opportunity. Without taking long time, I'm going to be moving on to speak on estimation of GFR in neonates. Is it reliable? So the first question is, not much about the renal morphology is understood in a neonate. The overview of this topic would be to understand what is GFR, the dynamics of GFR, how is it calculated, is GFR estimation required, is it reliable, and the suitable biomarker for GFR. So considering the renal dynamics, the postnatal maturation of the renal blood flow is due to reduction in renal vascular resistance of both efferent and efferent post-birth and increase in systemic blood pressure. So the renal dynamics from the fetus to the neonate, if we see the renal blood flow was only 2 to 4% of the cardiac output in the fetus, whereas it's about 5% at birth and 10% by 7 days of life. Glomerular filtration, what is it we are actually meaning by this word? We are meaning at a renal process in which the fluid in the blood is filtered off the glomerular capillaries into the Bowman capsule. This whole process is intended to remove the excess fluid and the waste. Now, what is glomerular filtration rate? If the same process is calculated over a specified period, it's called a glomerular filtration rate, the chief measure of the kidney function. And the end product in this is a urine. So in this image, we can see the efferent arterioles bringing in the blood, and then it moves into the capillaries, then comes the efferent arterioles. From here, for a urine to be excreted, it has to go through these 4 processes, that is the filtration, reabsorption, secretion, and finally the excretion. So all this we have read a lot. It's just a recap of this. So when we are talking about the glomerular filtration rate, we are going to be dealing with 2 forces that are opposing each other. That is the hydrostatic and the oncotic pressure, which is inside the glomerulus, versus the same in the Bowman capsule. So the ones which are going to be favoring the filtration will be the glomerular hydrostatic pressure and the colloid osmotic pressure, which is relatively 0 because there's no protein in it. And the forces inhibiting the filtration will be the osmotic pressure in the glomerular capillaries and the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman's capsule. Along with this, there is also something called the filtration coefficient K, which depends upon the permeability of the glomerular capillaries and their surface area. So this is also one of the reasons that we incorporate the K in a GFR estimate. When we are looking at the mechanism of GFR regulation, we have both intrinsic and extrinsic. The intrinsic is related only to the kidney. So the location of it is in the kidney, and its the mean arterial pressure at which it works is it's got a wide autoregulation, which means between 80 to 180 millimeters of mercury, and it maintains a constant GFR over a wide range of MAP. Now, what is this extrinsic mechanism of GFR regulation? They are transported from the blood through the bloodstream. They can be neuronal based or hormonal based. They come into big action when the mean arterial blood pressure actually falls, when the child is sick or the neonate is sick. So when the arterial BP goes down, the main intention for this is to maintain the blood volume and the pressure. So here we are looking at a GFR to look at the intrinsic functions of the kidney. Now let's see what is the GFR from fetus to a neonate. The glomerular diameter is about 110 micrometer, whereas it is 200 in the adult. The proximal tubular length is 2 millimeter, whereas it is 20 millimeter in an adult. The glomerular basement filter is also thin. It's only 100 nanometers versus 300 nanometers in an adult. The kidney weight increases proportional to the gestational age, weight, and body surface area. The GFR increases rapidly as the size and the number of nephrons increases. The GFR increases proportionally to the gestational age and level off at the time of birth. So what happens in numbers? The GFR in an adult is about 100 to 120 ml per minute per 1.73 meters squared, whereas in a full term, it is only about 20 ml per minute. The premature neonate has even much lesser, which is about 5 ml per minute, and they have associated immature tubules. So because of this, there's a lot of glycosuria, impaired potassium secretion causing hyperkalemia. This physiology we have to understand so that we really come in terms about what GFR we are actually trying to calculate. So to know some interesting facts about a preterm kidney, the fetal kidney starts to make urine by about 10 to 12 weeks of age, intrauterine age. The nephrogenesis continues till about 34 to 36 weeks when we are looking at a 1 million nephron per kidney. The fetus, if it's born before 34 weeks, the nephrogenesis can occur in the premature infant, but it is limited to only about 40 days. So if you're talking about a preterm baby who is born at 24 weeks, 40 days is approximately about 7 weeks. So it will have the number of nephrons of only a 31 weeks gestation. And then the nephrogenesis stops for it. However, like any other bigger child, the morphogenic evidence goes in for a compensatory changes consistent with the hyperfiltration. Premature neonates do not form new nephrons after 34 to 36 weeks of conception. So how does this GFR increase? The shaded area present the normal value. So you can see this 28 weeks, we are having a GFR close to about 7 to 8 ml, which keeps increasing exponentially to about 30 ml, close to about 36 weeks. And a term baby, which is close to about 25 to say about 20 ml, it reaches only 50 ml by 42 weeks. Still, they are much shorter than the adult GFR. So when we compare this is a chart in which it says the bar diagram, the upper portion represents the deficit between the neonatal GFR and mature levels. So at the end of 1 month even, you have about close to 50% deficit and the neonate is in relative renal insufficiency compared to adults. This is again about a comparison between the term and the preterm GFR with regards to inulin clearance. In this also, any time the term clearance is far better than the preterm clearance. Now, preterm kidney, what is it functionally different? So we earlier spoke about the embryology, but here what is it functionally different? The renal function of the preterm is different from term. The function varies with gestational age, kidney volume, and hemodynamic stability. Accurate measurement of GFR in infants is problematic due to unavailability of gold standard inulin, which we've been talking for long years. Creatinine to estimate GFR is unreliable in preterms due to its tubular secretions and reabsorption by immature kidney and its dependence on muscle mass, which is also much less in a preterm baby. Alternative endogenous markers to estimate GFR are cystatin C, which is not well studied, but we do have some promising results from that. Before we say that GFR is reliable or not, or conclude on that, we should understand why serum creatinine, which we are targeting or which we do on a daily basis is not very accurate for us. Now, the nice point of the creatinine is it has a steady concentration and very easy to measure. You have the caloric method as well as the estimate method. Creatinine is not reabsorbed by the renal tubules, but 10% of the creatinine in the urine is secreted by the renal tubule, resulting in an overestimation of GFR. Now, the other problem is the neonates are born with their maternal creatinine value, because till then the placenta acts as the filtration, so they are in equilibrium with each other. So whatever creatinine level that we are seeing on day 1 is going to be representing the maternal value. Even if the baby had an perinatal renal injury, creatinine values may still not be right because it is reflecting the maternal values, which are much higher than usual. The creatinine measure involves both kidney and muscle. An exponential rise in injury may not be seen because the muscle mass in a preterm or an early term or a term is going to be less. Serum creatinine to assess kidney function in neonates are posing some challenges because it is elevated at birth but does not reflect the infant's kidney function. Over the next few days, the GFR increases and the creatinine gradually falls until it reflects the infant kidney function. So kidney function may therefore manifest as either a rise in creatinine or failure to fall appropriately. So just with one value, we may not be able to identify whether this creatinine is appropriate, high or low for the age. The ratio, this is the diagram to see how much the mother and the baby, fetal cord and maternal serum creatinine during various part of the gestation. They freely diffuse across the placental barrier and they are very much close to each other. So they are in equilibrium. Now, what happens in the serum creatinine concentration over the first 52 days of life in a preterm neonate, less than 27 weekers and 31 to 32 weekers? So all these are given in millimoles per liter. So if it is like in a 27 weeker, then we are looking at a serum creatinine level at birth, which can be close to about 0.6 to 0.7. It exponentially increases by day 4 to about 1.2. And it comes to levels of 0.3 to 0.4 only by 52 days. And for a 31 weeker, it is less pronounced. It may reach up to about 1, but then that also to come to a level of 0.2, it takes about 0.3 to 0.4, it takes about 52 days. So this is their normographic representation. Now, when we are thinking about a GFR estimate, why do we want a GFR estimate? The major chunk is to identify very quickly AKI, and various other drug that we are using in NICU needs to be appropriately calculated based on the kidney function of the neonate. All of us know the traditional pre-renal, post-renal, intrinsic renal failure. But what is very common to all of this is, regardless of the etiology, the final common pathway is a fall in GFR. So the AKI, when we realized the AWAKEN study, which was in 2017, showed the overall incidence of AKI was 29.9%. And those with AKI had more than 4-fold higher independent odds of death and longer hospital stay. So when we saw the 22 to 29 weeks of gestation, almost 50% went through AKI. 29 to 36 weeks had 18.7 and more than 36 weeks had 37.8. That could be because of the perinatal insult, and 29 to 36 weeks was apparently a better grown preterm who was delivered in a appropriate environment. And in 22 to 29 was a very dicey gestation where many times even resuscitation was not offered. So diagnosis of acute renal failure in neonates is very important because we have to rapidly diagnose to identify the treatable condition. And since almost 50% of the preterms less than 29 weekers are going to be having AKI, high index of suspicion has to be there. Just relying on a serum creatinine value of 0.3 or 0.4 may not make this suspicion valid. Extensive antenatal history can be helpful. Serum creatinine has its own limitations. The BUN influenced is also influenced by other factors. if we calculate the fractional excretion of sodium is elevated physiologically and has superimposed developmental immaturity. So all these has its own limitation for it to be a single marker to identify the diagnosis of ARF. Then came so many criteria in which the rifle and the KDIGO. All this had the base on the serum creatinine levels and the urine output. And then came a modified version of it in which they said just a serum creatinine increased by 0.3 milligrams per deciliter fitted into stage 1 and a serum creatinine increased by 150 to 200% stage 2 and so on. But however, this has its own limitation when we are dealing with in the NICU. In NICU, these criteria are solely based on serum creatinine and urine output. They do not consider the cause or the site of kidney injury or location and mode of onset of AKI. AKI is generally a syndrome with broad spectrum of diseases and variety of pathophysiology. So, for example, a neonate can have a perinatal asphyxia. Along with that, he can go in for a drug toxicity. A poor fluid electrolyte balance can make him get further dehydrated, or he can go into osmotic diuresis, or he can be suffering from acidosis. When there is so many interplay, just measuring serum creatinine and urine output may not be adequate. Sometimes they don't go in for an oliguric renal failure. They are into polyuric also. They can, in many of the extreme preterms, we face polyuria in the initial phase. So keeping this criteria to identify the AKI or diagnose may not be very adequate for us for the spectrum of neonates. It may be for a specific use, but not for a spectrum of preterm and term neonates. It calls for constant differentiation of the cause and elimination for reversible factors. Since AKI is multifactorial, we might have to have better formulation and more accuracy in identifying these injuries. Now coming to GFR estimation. Why do we need a GFR estimation? Because it has the ability to accurately, precisely, and efficiently assess the kidney function essential in clinical medicine. It also facilitates the early detection of acute kidney injury. It helps to monitor medication-related nephrotoxicity. It also helps us to make dose adjustment of medications which are toxic or excreted by the kidney, whereas all this cannot be done with a single value of serum creatinine or FeNA. Now, when we see the serum creatinine versus estimated GFR, now this graph will tell us that the serum creatinine on day 1 can be anywhere between 0.8 to 0.4, and it reaches normalizes a value appropriate after 100 days. The GFR, which is also normalizing somewhere around close to about beyond 100 days. The need for precision is underscored by the now well-accepted finding that increase in serum creatinine as small as 0.3 milligrams per deciliter are associated with increased mortality and morbidity. So a creatinine increase of 0.3 milligrams per deciliter are associated with increased morbidity and mortality. So we need to have much more value into GFR to assess, because the serum creatinine rise may not happen immediately. Now, when we are talking about a GFR, we are always in search of an ideal marker for it. Freely filtered by glomerulus without being secreted, reabsorbed, or metabolized, it must be exclusively eliminated by the kidney. And so many other renal function tests have come in and gone. We have always spoken about the gold standard inulin, but it has its own disadvantage that it needs a continuous bladder catheterization and a vascular access. When we are calculating urinary clearance of creatinine, it again needs a 24-hour creatinine clearance. It has to be appropriately collected. Any change in the volume that we are doing may not be representative of the clear renal functions. Plasma clearance, if we are doing with radioactive dye, the baby is getting exposed to radiopharmaceuticals. So all of them have their own limitations. But then came a thought whether creatinine clearance is needed or serum creatinine is enough. So among these two, they realized that within 1 to 30 days of life, creatinine clearance can be directly determined from plasma creatinine, provided body length is taken into consideration. So it became a norm to have the length of the child into the practice, because we realized that the kidney volume, gestational age, everything is dependent upon the growth of the child. So after this, there was a challenge between the creatinine and the cystatin. Creatinine is, which is a better estimation in renal function. A small but variable amount is excreted by tubular secretion. It is well recognized as an insensitive marker for detection of small changes in kidney function. Whereas cystatin, it is reabsorbed and metabolized by the proximal tubule epithelial, not to be significantly affected by age, gender, or muscle mass, which happens in creatinine, but it is affected by glucocorticoids and thyroid dysfunction. So this is the cystatin, how it behaves in between the 28 to adult. So here also we can see the clearance is gradually improving with age, and it almost reaches the adult level at around 1 year to 3 years. Now, estimation equation for GFR. There were so many equations, number of formulas, but I think the time tested is the Schwartz and the Bryan. The primary determination of estimated GFR in preterm are gestation age and mean blood pressure. The cystatin level is a superior biomarker to serum creatinine in the assessment of GFR in premature infants, because it does not take into the it's not changed by other parameters such as the age, gestation age, or the muscle mass. GFR prediction formula has come in and gone. Despite its well-recognized limitation, serum creatinine remains the renal biomarker on which the clinician relied for estimating GFR. Preterm and term neonate GFR estimation by Bryan et al. In 1986, after one which happened in 1970, 1986, he was the one who changed the constant for a preterm and a term neonate from the existing 0.58 to a 0.33 in preterm and a 0.45 in term neonates, taking into the surface area of the glomerular capillaries, and considered the most appropriate estimated GFR in neonatal population. Now, the existing concerns of estimating GFR, cystatin C and serum creatinine estimates GFR differently in preterm infants below 31 weeks. When we do the Jaffe assay for estimating creatinine, it overestimates GFR by 20%. But we have the high performance liquid chromatography and the isotope dilution mass spectrometry. Though it's not widely available, they do perform even at low creatinine levels, which is not present in Jaffe. However, correction factors are now available for it. So at the end of this, the key message that I would like to confer is the glomerular filtration rate estimating equation provides more accurate estimate of kidney function in neonate than the serum creatinine alone. Whenever we are doing a serum creatinine, it is a point that we calculate the GFR, and the level of GFR and its magnitude of change of time are vital in the detection of kidney disease, understanding its severity, making decision about diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. Long-term follow-up of renal function in preterm should be lifelong. It should include assessment of GFR, total kidney volume relative to the body surface area. Thank you.
Thank you, Shobna. That was a very crisp class or a definition. GFR people thought go for rest, and it used to be a boring topic, and you made it very clear and crisp how the neonate or the fetus into the neonate maturity and the insufficiency which can be caused because of prematurity, and your detail about what is the upcoming cystatin, about cystatin. It was very good, very clear also, and very simple. So we'll go to the next speaker, Dr. Manikumar. And Dr. Manikumar is DCH, DMB, and he's a nodal officer in Chengalpattu Medical College, and he's heading the neonatal unit there. He's also a very good friend of mine, and he's supposed to be called the quiz master of South India. So all the medical, pediatric medical quiz will be conducted by Manikumar. Everywhere his name will be there. And he's very calm and composed, and his classes are very well taught in South all by the postgraduates. So let's see, when he's talking on about the fluid status. So let's get a speech on.
Yeah.
Welcome, Manikumar.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the introduction, sir. And first of all, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the whole team for inviting me to this webinar series. And without wasting much time, I think you are able to see the slides, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll be dealing with about fluid therapy in neonates, how different it is. So let me start with a quote actually. This is by one of the Nobel laureate, Albert Georgi. He said that water is life, matter and matrix, mother and medium. There is no life without water. So this whole topic, which I'm going to deal with in the subsequent slides, is concerned about the, I'll be dealing with body composition and a brief introduction about insensible water loss and the changes that occur after birth, and how to calculate fluids and how are we calculating, and we should know about the normal physiology of transition and the clinical targets. So this will be my overview for the subsequent 20 minutes or so. And this picture clearly demonstrates how much is the total body water right from early weeks of gestation in the fetal life to neonatal life. So you can see that at 16 weeks of life, the total body water constitutes to nearly around 90% of that, nearly 93% to be more precise. So after that, the total body water gradually decreases. And when you look at a 3-month extra-trained baby, it's roughly nearly around 60%. So this is a principle or phenomenon which occurs throughout life. So this continuum of change is very much important for us to understand the physiology of transition in a newborn baby. So this is primarily because the intracellular volume increases and the extracellular volume decreases actually. And the red cell permeability to water increases with age. And gradually more proteins are accreted inside the intracellular volume. And we can see that whenever there is protein starvation or a growth retardation of any cause, the intracellular volume is not increased. And you can expect the changes to occur accordingly in a growth retarded baby. So this is a distribution of total body water. We know that in a term baby, this is in this picture demonstrates term baby water balance. And the total body water is somewhere around 75% of the total body weight. So of which around 55 to 60% is intracellular water and the remaining is extracellular water. Extracellular water comprises of plasma and interstitium. The total body water composites of intracellular water and extracellular water. And this plasma volume is tightly regulated. So this interstitial fluid, we are still not very clear what are the regulating factors, but we often notice that it is also strictly regulated in newborns actually. So we know that the intracellular volume, the relative proportion of extracellular fluid decreases and the relative proportion of intracellular water increases with age. So this transition or the roughly at around 2 to 3 months of age, the intracellular water and extracellular water are roughly in equal amounts. So this transition is never ever in the whole period of lifetime of a human being. It's so marked, it's done in the newborn. So this picture clearly tells about the significance of importance of fat. So as you can see the picture, you can see in all other species, all are born with skin and bones. Only humans are born with fat. So this provides them a survival advantage. You can see all other species, every other species when they are born is literally skin and bones and they have to strive hard to survive. Humans are by nature have a survival advantage. So what is the relation between fat and body water? They are inversely proportional. The total body fat and the total body water are inversely proportional. So this is somewhat useful actually. So we relatively have a lower total body water at birth when compared with other species. And similar, by extrapolating the same concept, we can see that an infant of diabetic mother will have a relatively lesser total body water when compared to a normal baby. So I try to look at all the clinical correlates side by side. So whenever the fetal water balance is concerned, we are concerned mainly about the amniotic fluids. So this amniotic fluid provides the pressure and that maintains a lot of functions actually. So the amniotic fluid roughly it increases from 2 ml per hour at 12 weeks to around 165 ml at term. And the baby swallows the amniotic fluid and it is excreted through the fetal urine. That is the cycle of amniotic fluid literally. So after that. So the baby swallows nearly around 500 ml per 24 hours and it is completely refreshed every 3 hours actually. So the clinical correlates of that will be whenever there is a renal agenesis or some other renal outlet obstruction problems, we can see that the amniotic fluid volume decreases. It will have typical oligodermias. And this oligodermias will be decreasing the pressure inside the uterus, and that pressure is very, very essential for lung growth also. So whenever there is a long-standing early onset oligodermias of any cause, there will be pulmonary hypoplasia too. So on the contrary, the lung fluid actually comes out in utero. What happens is that there is some amount of lung fluid, though it is very minimal, it significantly contributes to amniotic fluid volume. So it comes out of it, and when that is adding to the pressure of the amniotic fluid actually. So that is made use of even in some therapeutic strategies like intrauterine treatment of congenital diaphragmatic hernia, where we plug the trachea, thereby increasing the pressure inside the lungs, which increases the lung growth. So that pressure is very much essential for lung growth, basically. And similarly, esophageal atresia, the swallowing of fluid is decreased, and we will have polyurethremias. So this corollary, we should be as a clinician knowing all those things. And the amniotic fluid volume reaches a maximum by at around 33 to 35 weeks of gestation, and after that it starts falling down. And we can typically see that in post-mature babies, there is most often associated with oligodermias. So this lung fluid, which I was saying, is very, very essential, and delayed clearance of lung fluid. So what are the factors that cause the clearance of lung fluid is that from the secretory state inside the lungs, the transition occurs to an absorptive state. So this is influenced by various hormones of labor. During the stress of the labor, various hormones are released, typically includes glucocorticoids and catecholamines, and that creates a switch of secretory state to absorptive state, which rapidly clears the lung fluid. And if it is delayed, it can cause something like what is called as the transient tachypnea of newborn, which is called as TTN. So this TTN is relatively very common. So as a clinician, we can see that after 38 weeks or so, surfactant deficiency respiratory distress syndrome is very, very rare. So there the clinical picture of respiratory distress is predominantly seen with the transient tachypnea of newborn. So this picture clearly tells the rough proportion of that, where it is relatively more common in that baby. So this is what actually Dr. Shobana has already dealt with, and you can see in this figure that the red line which shows the renal mass and the green line shows the number of nephrons. You can see that the number of nephrons, or what is called as the nephrogenesis, is nearly complete by 33 to 34 weeks of gestation. So after that, the number doesn't increase, but the nephron size increases and the renal size overall increases. So in utero, the size is roughly equal to the gestation age. Say, for example, for a 20-weeker baby, the size is 20 millimeters. For a 30-weeker baby, it's 30 millimeters. Roughly it equals to. And the size continues to increase throughout life. So these physiological aspects also we should be knowing, and GFR is very well dealt with the previous speaker, and they have a diminished ability to concentrate urine, newborn kidneys. And they have also a limited ability to conserve free water. So as a clinician, we should know about the urine output, and usually the baby has a capacity of somewhere around 30 ml of urine in the urinary bladder at birth. So the first void most often occurs at the time of delivery, and it is most often missed because of the amniotic fluid volume. It's most often missed, and we can wait up to 48 hours for the first void actually. So in the initial first 24 hours, the rough urine volume is around 20 ml, and after that it increases to more than 200 ml in the 12th day after birth. So with this background, during the intrauterine life, we are now transitioning to the extrauterine life, where we are concerned about water losses. So whenever we talk about water balance, so we will talk about what is called as a sensible water loss and insensible water loss. Sensible is what is through the urine and fecal water loss and water gained inside the body. And these insensible water loss we will be concentrating more upon, because that is what is clinically manipulated, and this is what we should know more about when dealing with the fecal therapy in kidneys. So the skin contributes to nearly 2/3 of the insensible water loss, and the respiratory epithelium contributes to 1/3 of the insensible water loss. So these we can't see, but it is naturally happening, right? So I think it's next slide is cleaner. Yeah. So the ways to decrease insensible water loss we will be seeing in the subsequent slides. And even when a baby is nursed in an incubator, so this much amount of insensible water loss occurs in a baby actually. This slide clearly states that it's around 15 to 20 ml in more than 1.5 kgs, and it's nearly 40 to 60 ml in 1 to 1.5 kgs, and 60 to 80 or even 100 ml in extreme preterms. So So the insensible water loss can be to an extent of it varies widely across the gestational age and birth weight of the baby. So this we should be knowing, and this is clearly demonstrated in the graph shown here. So in say for example a 500-gram baby, it is nearly around 7 ml per kg per hour, and in a term baby it's nearly 0.5 ml per kg per hour. The number of times it is escalated is nearly 14 or 15 times. And this graph shows the importance of skin maturation over a period of time. So this graph shows the importance of knowing the changes in insensible water loss over a period of time in any baby. The skin matures very rapidly irrespective of gestation. Even in an extreme premature baby, by 2 weeks of age, nearly the skin is as mature as a full-term baby as far as transepidermal water loss is concerned. So this slide shows that on first day in an extreme preterm, it can be very high. And by literally the second week or third week, it's nearly equal to that in a term baby. Right. So coming, the importance of keeping the baby naked versus dressed. So a simple dressing the baby or even covering by a flexible polyurethane plastic non-occlusive skin barrier, we just put a cling wrap, that's all. So that itself reduces the insensible water loss by nearly 60 to 70%. You can see that a naked baby on day 1 loses by nearly 27 ml per kg per day, and whereas a dressed baby nearly it's only 9 actually. So you can see the impact of just putting a dress or a cling wrap to the baby. So what are the measures to prevent insensible water loss? You can increase the ambient humidity, or you can humidify the inspired gas. You can use some topical agents like cling wrap or so, clothing, and also anti-infective steroids to some extent by maturing the ion channels. It helps that. And we have to take care of ways to improve the skin maturity. So in the subsequent slides, we will see about some of the ways to improve the reduce the insensible water loss. This is what we do generally. We just cover the baby with a cling wrap. You can see the plastic wrap by which the baby is covered, just like that, that's all. So that reduces the evaporative water loss to a greater extent, and this is very much used to get a good thermal status as well as a fluid status. And this is a good study by our own Indian study by Shushma et al. In 2006, where the application of coconut oil itself significantly reduces the insensible water loss. So this is a routine in most of the growing preterms in most of the units nowadays. And finally, you can't underestimate the importance of a kangaroo mother care, KMC, which reduces the mortality as well as infection and also the insensible water loss to a greater extent. Here you can see the mother actually nursing 2 babies simultaneously in KMC. That even can be done actually. So this is a norm literally, and even we are moving towards a mother NICU along with that. So when this insensible water loss is not taken care of, what happens clinically is that the baby will lead on to fever. So this is sometimes called as what is called as a dehydration fever. Actually, it is a misnomer. It's not actually fever. It is actually a hyperthermia. When there is excess water loss, this typically happens in the summer and inexperienced mother with reduced intake of milk. So hypothermia, though it will have both fever and hypothermia have high temperature. In hypothermia, we will have a warm feet. And in fever, we have peripheral vasoconstriction. In hypothermia, we will have extended posture, and baby is otherwise healthy where the baby with fever is sick. So as a clinician, it might be very easy to differentiate between these two. So never this change in intrauterine concept from the intrauterine environment to the extrauterine environment, this transition, this is what we are trying to get basically. So we all know that all babies lose certain weight during the postnatal first few days of life, and that is primarily because of a contraction of extracellular fluid. So this can be to the core of up to 10% in term babies and up to 15% in preterm babies. So this wonderful study clearly demonstrates that all the weight loss is primarily because of a contraction in extracellular fluid volume rather than a reduction in intracellular fluid volume. So all the excess extracellular fluid is lost literally. And this is very much essential because the phenomenon which causes all these diuresis is that we all know over a period of time is that only diuresis causes the C-shape contraction. So what causes diuresis is that the baby's lungs are inactive during fetal life, and once the baby starts breathing, so the pulmonary vascular resistance increases, which leads to increased venous return to the heart, and that distance the atrium, releasing atrial natriuretic peptide, which causes natriuresis or diuresis. So this diuresis is really essential, and we have to know the normal phenomenon which happens during the postnatal life. all babies lose weight. So this is for a term baby. They lose around 1 to 2% weight per day. They reach a maximum of 10% weight loss by around third to fourth day, maximum up to 5 days. And they regain the birth weight by around 1 week or to a maximum of 10 days in a term baby. So in a preterm baby, it happens very similar, but the loss is very deeper. We can lose 2 to 3 babies per day in a preterm baby, and the maximum loss is around 15%. They regain birth weight by around 10 to 14 days of life. So these nomogram are being established for finding how much is the weight loss and how is our baby responding and all. So these are primarily to detect excess weight loss baby or indirectly a poor feeding baby, to concentrate upon those to prevent what is called as a hypernatremic dehydration. So this is a typical history of a hypernatremic dehydration where a primary 30-year-old anxious mother done elective LSCS, had delayed adaptation, shifted to NICU for some respiratory distress. So initial separation with the baby. On day 3, baby having high temperature but settled after a while, and baby is kept over covered in summer. And baby is treated for jaundice even though the bilirubin level is very low, and treated with intensive phototherapy, and mother asked not to feed or decrease the duration of feeding to increase the duration of phototherapy. So this pattern of a clinical picture is very often happening in most of the babies, especially it's very common in tropical countries like India during the summer season. We often see nearly around 200 babies being admitted with hypernatremic dehydration in one season in our unit actually. So this are the common associations as we see, and the breast milk sodium is also very high in these mothers, adding to the insult of hypernatremic dehydration. So our goals of therapy in fluid therapy are to not to maintain a balance, but to allow the postnatal extracellular fluid loss to happen. But this should happen without causing any detrimental effects to the cardiovascular status. So our goals is to allow contraction without compromising respiratory and cardiovascular function, and provide enough water for growth. And we have to create a negative balance during the initial week of life, followed by avoiding excess transabdominal water loss and avoiding oliguria for more than 12 hours. And similarly, excess caution is taken for preterm baby to because the kidney's ability is very much limited, and we have to be taking extra care to prevent insensitive water loss in a premature baby for obvious reasons. And if this water loss is not allowed to happen, what happens is that it increases both the intravascular volume, which predisposes to IVH and PDA, or intraventricular hemorrhage and patent ductus arteriosus in the initial week of life. And in the later period of life, it will lead on to bronchopulmonary dysplasia and necrotizing enterocolitis. So these 4 are the cardinal killers in a preterm baby. This intraventricular hemorrhage and PDA. The PDA can have not only because of its effect on the heart, but it can have systemic effects also. It can aggravate feed intolerance and necrotizing enterocolitis. So this dive reflex is happening in most of the time. So we may not be able to rely upon urine output at some point of time, that though it gives a good indicator of the adaptations that are happening. So this dive reflex, what we call as a diving seal reflex. Seal is an animal which lives both in land and water. So what happens in seal is that it has a heart rate of somewhere around nearly 100 when the animal is in land, and it decreases to somewhere around 5 to 10 when the seal dives inside the water. So they will be diving inside water for around some 15 to 30 minutes. So at the end of 30 minutes, we can see the heart rate somewhere around 10. So this is very marked in seal. So a similar change which happens at shunting of blood to vital organs, which are brain, heart, and adrenals, stealing blood away from the non-vital organs, which typically includes gut, kidneys, liver, and lungs and all. So this we have to keep in mind by taking into the consideration the urine output of the baby. So finally, this water calculation, how we often give 60 ml per kg for a term baby on day 1. So this magical number of 60, we will see how it, whenever we talk about water, we talk about insensible water loss through the skin and the respiratory tract. And the sensible water loss include urine and fecal water loss and water retained in the tissues for growth. So this is another thing. So we often expect a weight gain of around 15 grams per kg per day for a normal optimal growth. So what is optimal growth to occur, considering the fact that around 60 to 2/3 is only water? So we need a water retention for growth of around 10 ml per kg per day. The fecal water loss is 5 to 10 ml per kg per day. So this water, fecal water loss is usually compensated by water gained by oxidation. So that is roughly around 5 to 10 ml per kg. So these two cancel each other, and we don't consider this water of oxidation and fecal water loss for all the fluid calculations. So barring these, we will be concerning only about instance water loss, urine loss, and the water gain for growth and all. So these will be the three things which we'll be discussing. And the average ability to concentrate for a kidney, we take it as 300 milliosmoles per liter, because the range is somewhere around 100 to 500, gives some leeway for the newborn kidneys. And a solute load is typically on day 1 of life for a normal basal metabolic rate with a normal amount of breast milk intake. It's around 15 milliosmoles per kg. So these two calculate to somewhere around 50 ml per kg per day for urine volume. So this much amount of urine volume, and we know that the insensible water loss is around 20. So we want to give 70, and considering a negative water balance of 10, we will be giving around 60 ml per kg per day. So this is the rationale for giving around 60 ml per kg per day on day 1 in a term baby. And similarly, for a preterm baby, 1 to 1.5, the insensible water loss is nearly around 40. So we increase it to 80 ml per kg per day. And in an extremely low birth weight baby, we increase it further to around 100 ml per kg per day. So we go up to a maximum of 180 in preterms and 150 in term babies. So the fluid chart is always not a fixed one, barring the day 1 of life. We don't give clear-cut recommendations as to this much only has to be given for day 2 and all. So we often review the weight chart, urine output, insensible water loss, serum sodium, osmolarity, and also the underlying condition before writing the fluid therapy for a particular child. So all these has to be taken into care, and the urine creatinine values and all Dr. Shobna has dealt with, and urine output we are seeing earlier. So the special considerations will be for extreme prematurity, where there will be coexisting RDS, where the insensible water loss will also be very high, and because of respiratory distress, the respiratory water loss is also very high. So these asphyxia can coexist in these babies, where so during the first week of life, our aim is to advance nutrition, whereas we have to optimize heart and lung functions. So this is a very typical baby who had a stormy course, where the initial weight loss is very huge, but later caught up. And during the later stage of a premature baby, we will be optimizing caloric intake with taking care not to induce NEC with fluid overload and liver damage. So this is a baby who had an initial poor growth as well as a later growth. This is not very, very uncommon in unit actually. We have to take care of this by aggressive parental nutrition nowadays. So all these result in unacceptable high levels of variability in outcomes and practice. So as I said earlier, these 4 cardinal morbidities we have to keep in mind: IVH, PDA, BPD, and NEC. So this is my final slide actually. I just want to concentrate upon this. This is a very typical fluid order extreme preterm baby. And usually we start with somewhere around 90 to 100 ml per kg per day. So we will be looking at the sodium values very often, even up to 3 times a day. So because of the excessive transeptal water loss in an extreme premature baby, and because of excess extracellular fluid loss, the sodium levels is bound to increase. So accordingly, we may have to titrate by increasing the fluid. So we will be needing somewhere around 90. Say for example, it's 137 at birth, we gave 90, and it increases to 142, we gave 100, and after that we gave even up to 120 on day 1 itself. And it even increases to 152 and 155 by 36 hours of life, where we kept gone up to 180. Most important change which happens on day 3 is that the keratinization improves and the insensible water loss drastically reduces, as we have seen on the chart. So this physiology we should be aware of, and we should be reducing the fluid gradually, or else the sodium loss is very huge, and by day 4 or so we can have some significant clinical manifestations of PDA. So there we will be having to reduce the fluid to somewhere around 80 or 60. So as you can see, the fluid changes from 60 to 180 in a span of 4 days. So all these fluid changes will be changing dynamically, and this is what I wanted to understand in preterm physiology. So no tailor-made fluid order like something like day 1 this much, day 2 this much, and all. Day 1 we have taken into mind, but always consider the ongoing status of the baby, how's the baby, and we may need to repeat electrolytes very often in the early stages of life. So I think with this I end my talk, and the whole purpose of fluid therapy is to enable smooth transition by ensuring a normal postnatal weight loss. So this is what I wanted to convey. Thank you for the patient hearing.
Thank you, Manikumar. It was extensive, and you made that topic very simple. From starting from how the fetus, which was water, which brings changes into matter, and survival advantage. All that you have clearly made a nice presentation, and it is very useful to all.
Thank you, sir.
The next speaker is Dr. Ishwar Raja Dinakaran. He is the clinical lead Department of Neonatology at Rela Institute and Medical Center, Chennai. His inclination is towards perinatology and he has got a lot of publications. His publication is on Indian Journal of Pediatrics in 2006 on neonatal diabetes mellitus with recurrent hepatitis, and in Indian Pediatrics in 2009 on profile of viral hepatitis A in Chennai. And the next publication is in Indian Journal of Pediatrics again in 2008 on anti-nuclear antibodies in Mycobacterium tuberculosis infection. Over to Dr. Ishwar Raja.
Thank you, Kalai, Dr. Kalai, and for your kind words. And let's have a discussion on the neonatal hypertension. Yeah. So good evening, everybody. Today, my topic will be on neonatal hypertension. In day-to-day NICU care, we see more of hypotension and shock, and we forget to see hypertension. So let's see a number of babies who are getting into hypertension and what are the complications. We'll see that. And this is my team, and I work at Rela Hospital at Chennai. I'm a clinical aide, and all my colleagues with this team, I could perform all these good things and neonatal. They're so much possessed with hypotension and hypoxia. We forget to see hypertension. Yes, hypertension do happen in the NICU units, and we need to cleanly define them and identify them. And this is very important. The complications of hypertension, if missed, it is very drastic. And a very difficult thing is hypertension is how to define them. There is no much of definitions. People are getting confused. So sometimes to extend, and hypertensive baby, when you use inotropes, everything, once you know, the BP shoots up. We are happy to see the BP shooting up, but missing the hypertension. So let's see how to approach neonatal hypertension. What are the determinants of blood pressure? Particularly a few words on prematurity and low birth weight and their connection with hypertension and the management outcome. So neonatal hypertension, it is happening in both term and preterm at about 1 to 2% in a regular NICU unit, and it should be looked for and sought for, because people on an average, they see the numbers and just skip the outcome. Most babies are related to the umbilical catheter associated thrombosis and renal parenchyma. Yes, these nowadays 24-week, 25-week surviving by placement of umbilical catheter is very important in the first few days. So these babies are also getting into hypertension very often. Iatrogenic cause, suppose if you overlook such as how to calculate infusion as met by Dr. Manikumar, should take care of daily measuring the baby urine output, weight, everything, and calculating. And then when you should be always ready to bring down the inotropic agents when not required. And requirement of antihypertension. Again, we have NICU units use very less of antihypertensives to treat the hypertension. So this is a common pickup. Sometimes they have genetic influence or environmental factor, starting from the sodium hemostasis, if there is a derangement or a functional vasoconstriction or defect in the vascular smooth muscle structure. This is commonly happening in the low birth baby in a PIH mother. So these things actually are called mechanism to prevent the hypotension. But when this persists for a longer time, it is becoming determinantal and becoming hypertensive, causing the complications. So with that, definition, it's hypertension in this age group. It is by the pressure is more than 90 percentile for the infant, similar age, size, and gender. It is for both term and preterm, and lots of work is done by Zubrow, and Zubrow's charts are used for the identification of hypertension. And they are staged depending upon the between 95th to 99 percentile, probably stage 1, and more than 99% on add on 5 milligram, it will go into stage 2. So these staging and identification is used for treatment, for the treatment. Okay, so now we'll see, while handling a neonatal hypertension, we also have to look into what is happening with the fetal blood pressure. This fetal blood pressure is monitored, very important monitor, particularly in pregnancy-induced hypertension or a pre-eclampsia, because the blood supply to the placenta is less during this condition. So the fetus has to adjust the circulation to have the good outcome of the heart and thing. So that poor placenta is sufficient enough to meet the fetal demands. Lowering the metal pressure. Suppose if the baby is having mother is having PAH, and if you try to lower the pressure, it can also have other issues like known to have additional pressure changes in the response to antihypertensive treatment or the pH, uncontrolled pH. So fetal blood pressure also is very important. The arterial blood pressure change in response to antihypertensive treatment all the mother. Okay, so mother not only by the presence of PAH, but also the treatment which the mother takes for the antihypertensive also influences the fetal blood. BP is measured by using the pulsed Doppler velocity in the fetal descending aorta. So the hypertension starts from in utero. So you should be watching even if there is a issue in mother and also mother who's taking on drugs, we should be monitoring the fetal blood pressure. So actually, let's see what is the neonatal hypertension natural history. How does it come up? After the initial decrease in BP for the first 3 years, it increases rapidly over the next 2 weeks. Particularly, the systolic blood pressure increases about 2.5 to around 2.7, and diastolic BP by 1.6 to 2. So we tend to the BP pressure increases as the age improves. Rate of rise of BP in preterm is more than the term. Yes, exactly. They try to catch up, and the changes undergo because of prematurity. The rise in temperature is more. And the risk, as I told you, more of prematurity, low birth weight, and permanent hypoxia. All these conditions, the big list of conditions, it's a predisposed. Why this is important? In a baby, if they have multiple risk factors, they land up in hypertension and the complication. So we are in the view of any NICU consultant who does the rounds, they always look into see a prolonged CFT or hypotension or shock. The people forget to look for the hypertension. When risk factors are there, we need to take extra care to identify them and save the complication. What is the determination of neonatal blood pressure? Yes, there is determination. If the babies or preterm babies are low birth weight, there are lots of influence on maternal age, anesthesia, and the mode of delivery. People say it is normal delivery, the blood pressure rises over the next 2 days slower than the cesarean section. And particularly maternal hypertension, as we already dealt, mother's flow to the placenta varies, and particularly if she's on medication, again, it also affects the fetal blood pressure and leading to neonatal hypertension. Maternal treatment like antenatal corticosteroid. The antenatal corticosteroid is a standard of care for these days to prevent premature ductal closure or respiratory distress and other PDA. So those corticosteroids also has an influence on the neonatal. With respect to the neonatal, the gestational age, the more premature, there is lots of complication and the chance of getting hypertension is more. And with respect to post-conception and also very low birth weight. So exactly how do we do this? We need to monitor BP. The gold standard would be indwelling arterial catheter, but may not be happening to all babies and at different centers. The other one would be mode of indirect measurement monitoring. It would be by oscillatory method or oscillometry. Thus now the non-invasive method is commonly followed by the oscillometry. So with the basic, we need to know about systolic, diastolic, and mean arterial pressure. All three are important for the thing. And mean arterial pressure is the average pressure during the entire cardiac cycle and integrates the area under the pressure waveform. And also pulse pressure. With this pulse pressure is not calculated by using the oscillometry. So we follow oscillometric method of all the most of the measurements. Non-invasive BP is by oscillometric method, whereas with auscultation and Doppler, not much useful in pediatric, in neonatology. Out measurement plot. Yeah, as I told you already, initial work more done by Zubro chart, and recently from Indian Samartal from Japan has published a percentile. It's very useful. It is relatively extensive also. And neonatal BP charts, most of the units follow after 2 weeks. Dionin et al.'s collection of data. So very important. We'll give some more time for this procedure of recording. Very important. The infant should be prone than supine. One is very important. The method uses oscillometric method in most of the devices come. Selection of cuff is very important because people try to think when you use a small cuff, the BP reading might be correct. It is exactly opposite. If you use a more smaller cuff, the BP raise will be more. And the cuff should be kept in the right upper arm. That should be a standard way. And timing, exactly. Baby should be sleeping either or in a well awake state, not angry or crying. And it should be at least 15 minutes. That should not be doing any procedures. And you should do at least 1.5 hours after major procedure. Like suppose if you get IV access, if you do some procedure, you need to give at least 1.5 hours. You need to do at least 3 readings and at least 2 minutes apart. So this standard method should be followed by most of the NICU units. And it is better to form because unnecessarily we might miss hypertension. So selection of the cuff is very, very important. And if you see this cuff measurement, it should be appropriate. So there are various sizes of cuffs available for that. Yeah. So Zubrovstat is used for both with respect to the gestational age and birth weight and gender. And this is diagonal chart is between between 22 to 44 weeks. He's got a 3 centiles correction. Okay, these are the Indian data. The blood pressure variation with gestational age and birth weight in India. This is a large study, about 1,671 babies. Normative data, they have made a neonatal normative BB data like how Zubrov's and Dinans. Okay, so this is a tip for everybody. This is what we do in the R unit. What we do is we put a graph sheet first, and when the baby is, for example, if it's a 30-weeker, we identify what is the systolic or a diastolic BP, and after identifying that what is, we write up like upper limit, what is the 70 or diastolic for this baby, the lower limit, write it down, and make another, open the chart, and we mark a red line and a blue line. If the marking, the plotting of blood pressure values are above this, visually it tells us earlier than the other identification that this baby is getting into hypertension. So this is how. So this is a plain 2 lines are drawn with respect to the blood pressure and the time interval. So this is we practice in our unit to identify the hypertension value, because we are looking out for hypertension. Hypertension should not get missed out. Yeah. So how do you approach? So this is how do you approach, as with any condition, history, physical examination, and laboratory and follow. How do we follow? We'll see that. In the NICU, we commonly see babies in the neonatal period who was recovering and getting discharged, hypertension, and very important, this post NICU. On a follow-up, everybody is happy. The parents are happy, the mother is happy, and we should not miss to pick up a hypertension, particularly child with BPD, or we who had a severe course in the NICU. So those follow-up should be having physical examination and also a recording of BP. Adult. So now there's a concept of fetal onset of adult disease. Yes, particularly the premature babies or the SGA babies who catch up a weight very fast, they are getting into hypermetabolic syndrome leading to BP, hypertension. In NICU, particularly improper assessment of blood pressure. Exactly. That's why we gave lots of time to know how to do a blood pressure monitoring, and particularly excess of inotropes. We need to look at the inotropes usage. If it's excess, we need to come out fast. And dehydration. These are the common things can happen, because if there is variation in the water loss, this can be happening. And asynchronous ventilation or pain. All these NICU conditions, you should alert you that these babies can go into hypertension. Yeah, this is adult onset, more caused by maternal undernutrition, pre-eclampsia, and bacterial infection, particularly chorioamnionitis, maternal age, elderly mother, or the fetal causes. All this can cause intrauterine growth retardation, but also they also damage the early endothelial dysfunction, leading to long-term cardiovascular related disease. This is related to the Barker's hypothesis. That is, these babies have tried to survive all the insult, but later they can develop into the adult onset disease like hypertension and diabetes mellitus. So in history taking, prenatal history of delayed crying or passage of meconium is very important. Anti-inflammatory, we have already told mothers on medication, drugs, or maternal diabetes. Targeting image on fetal anomaly, like any renal anomalies, can be there. Post-natal history, placement, if there is umbilical catheter history, we need to follow this very much. Even medication, they may be on some medication for the other conditions, for steroid, long steroid, or tapering steroids. Those things should be taken care. Postnatal course and morbidity in nursery. So the history taking is very important. So the risk factor can be listed down and followed up in the clinic follow-up team. And for the cause, if you see, there's a big list. Very common is a renal artery thrombosis or thromboembolism is very common. And renal parenchyma. Suppose we do not use proper GFR, as our earlier speakers showed, how the maturation and susceptibility of a GFR of the newborn. We do not take care by using the drugs or fluid overload or other improper BP maintenance. All this can damage the kidney. Yeah. So these are the bronchopulmonary, because when bronchopulmonary dysplasia, there is a prolonged hypoxia which causes endothelial injury, and that can predispose to hypertension. So So this is to complete the thing, particularly obstructive in PUV, congenital malformation, multicystic diseases, and uteroplacental junction obstruction, and pulmonary pneumothorax and congenital neuroblastoma. So these all factors can be causing to hypertension. So how do we clinically pick up? Usually, if you see the nurse presses the button, she says, "This baby is blood pressure is a little rising." So if you do not have a pictorial chart, we might miss the hypertension. So we should be very clear how do you monitor the hypertension. So these children present with apnea, tachypnea, varied. You list anything, newborns can present with varied presentation like tachycardia, cyanosis, extreme irritability, vomiting. So we need to have a look around or follow these babies with whether they are hypertension. So the flow chart will say, so usually you check the blood pressure. How much is it? What is the ranging blood pressure? Okay. So suppose if there is no identified cause, we need to investigate further. We look at this a little more in detail. And particularly this premature baby and low birth baby, they are at risk of development of hypertension. So it's well known this damage to the kidney can alter the outcome, particularly with hypertension. So if you miss hypertension, they can lead to cardiomegaly or sometimes even to the intraventricular bleed for those babies. These preterms are exposed to oxygen concentration markedly higher in the intrauterine environment, and this may be important consider postnatal development. So we should not consider the preterm as a first day baby or second day. It should be 32 weeker plus 1 day. So the intrauterine milieu is causing all these issues to the baby. With respect to the management, so we need to investigate and treat. So let's see first line of investigation and second line of investigation. Let's see what are the things coming up. Treatment, correction of iatrogenic. Most of the hypertension settles if there is a correction of the iatrogen, like more fluid, inotropes. Control of BP with antihypertensives and treatment of underlying etiology. Like if there is a renal vein thrombosis, what we do. If there is a polycystic kidney, what we can do for them, we'll see. So first line of investigations, usually you check for a complete analysis of urine, look for the proteinuria, and also electrolytes for hypokalemia and hyperkalemia. So these are creatinine we saw in depth, depending on what is the role of creatinine and GFR, and blood urea nitrogen and arterial gases. And look for the echocardiogram for structural functional anomaly. The coarctation can present us with hypertension. And cardiac enzymes and adults if there is any hemorrhage of bleed. Second line would be, that's a big list actually. So sometimes thyroid hormone, hyperthyroidism we should not miss. Hormonal assay, these things are very common, but at least these underlying things should be done for a second line. Serum cortisol level and abdominopelvic for the mass and nuclear study if required for a parenchymal injury. And sometimes at least if not all this, at least in case of a neonatal hypertension crisis, we need to do this common investigation along with cortisol serum. This is a minimal requirement investigation for this baby to identify hypertension. Treatment. The natural history of hypertension when it present in the neonate is unique and compared to yes. This preterm, the newborn babies usually settle over a short period. The timing of antihypertensive therapy is controversial and data regulated. So when to treat the babies with antihypertensive? See, most of the neonatal thing, they don't do antihypertensive very aggressive. Usually if there is no complication, there is no end organ damage, usually it is started a little late, or if there is signs of persistent stage 2 hypertension. BP greater than 99 central or post-consultation or 6 should be managed with pharmacological agent. Severe and symptomatic hypertension should be treated with intravenous. To improve the outcome, first initially we start with IV medication, then once we switch to the oral. Yeah, these are a large collection of drugs used, and it depends upon what are the babies and what is required. And is there any role of pediatrics? Yes, few babies may require a surgical treatment like renal malformation, renal vessel thrombosis, or a polycystic kidney and tumors. So exactly. So the parents ask us, so doctor, whatever may be reason for hypertension, what is the outcome? The outcome is good. It is called in neonatal hypertension. If it's renal, then hypertension persists for childhood alone. Blood pressure usually gets normalized follow-up of a neonatal word, neonatal hypertension, secondary to bronchopulmonary. So the cause is important. So if it is because of a bronchopulmonary thing, it improves over time. Suppose if in hypertension, if it's related to the umbilical artery catheter, the hypertension usually resolves over time. Again, this is also a good outcome, but requires an increase in their antihypertensive for a few months only. Usually possible to wean off the antihypertensive to make further doses in infant condition. So overall, the outcome it is good depending upon the cause. The commonest cause being the umbilical catheter, that is also a very good thing. The long-term prognosis for infants with hypertension in most is quite depending upon the course of underlying etiology. The iatrogenic cause, this has to be done in the NICU before discharge itself, that iatrogenic cause should be looked into. If the neurons features of end-organ dysfunction, it is not favor, like a cardiac failure or renal failure. Those things may not come out well. So very important. The message is identify the babies in NICU who are having the risk of hypertension and treat them early and have a good follow-up in the postnatal area. These children do a very good outcome. So thank you for 1 hour. Actually, we are here because it's coronavirus. We are having a webinar. So thanks to all of you to being part of this. I'm very happy about it. Thank you. Dr. Kalai? Dr. Kalai?
Yeah, sir. I have unmuted. Thank you so much, sir, for enlightening us on neonatal hypertension and making us aware of the right modality of choosing your instruments for measuring hypertension in newborns. Can we take up the questions, sir?
Yeah, sure. So,
the first question is to Dr. Shobna. Like GFR in newborn is low. So how do we dose the drugs in newborn?
So that is based, hello? So that's based on the creatinine clearance. So once you measure the length of the baby and also you have the creatinine levels periodically monitored, even though the GFR is low, according to this creatinine clearance, you will have to change the drug dose accordingly. That's why we basically use this formula to see what is the dosage that we have to use for the neonates in the ward. So even though the GFR is low, that is the reason the drugs are modified for these babies. Meropenem, which you might give thrice a day, may come only once in twice a day, or a gentamicin or a amikacin might come once in 48 hours. So the GFR is low. You have to use this corrected version to choose your drug dosage.
Okay. Thank you. Next question is again to Dr. Shobna. How long maternal creatinine level will be there in term babies postnatally?
So in that chart, usually it may be up to about 72 hours. It is also impacted by the other injuries that the baby has faced through. But per se, talking only about the maternal creatinine values, in these preterms, they generally, with about less than 27 weekers and around 31 weekers, they tend to take about 4 days to fall off to their normal values. But in a term baby, it may happen a little more earlier, around 48 hours.
Okay, I would like to ask a question. Mani?
Yeah, excellent. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have noticed we are regularly using antenatal steroid. Has that any improved insensible water loss or any advantage regarding the fluid balance?
Yes, sir. Now it has become the norm actually. Most of the published studies have documented a good coverage of antenatal steroids. So all those which I have quoted and have shown are in an era of nearly complete coverage of antenatal steroids, and we can take the results. Though it has reduced to some extent, it is an important factor that we have to consider clinically. But still, all those other causes, causing through those transabdominal water loss, which contributes to around 2/3 of the insensible water loss. So that plays a major part in our clinical decision rather than the respiratory water loss alone. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We have 2 other questions. This question is for Dr. Ishwar Raja. What is the preferred drug for hypertension in neonates?
Beta blockers are used, but again, you should be very cautious before start using particularly. Look for the identifiable cause and start before getting starting antihypertensive. I would recommend a cardiologist to be involved while starting the drugs. And we use beta blockers and immunosuppression. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Thank you, sir. I think again the next question is again the same thing. Common antihypertensives used in units. I think we have already
Yeah,
answered.
yeah.
Next question is which reference should be used to determine the renal dose adjustment for antibiotics and other drugs? This question has been shooted to Dr. Shobna.
So you have all the drug charts. If you're using BNF or Frankshan, they all come with a creatinine clearance and the chart for separate drugs. If you use the respected drug dosage, they have their own chart, or they have the standardized chart on how to adjust the dose. And they also have added parameters like how is the weight, how low is the weight of the baby, and is it less than 1,200 grams, more than 1,200 grams, more than 2 kg. They have a separate division for this. So you can use the fraction or the BNF to choose the drug dosage for the preterms.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shobna. Like, Ishwar sir, do you have any questions from your end?
Doing fine.
I think the next question has come up. The next question is to Dr. Ishwar Raja. Do you monitor mean blood pressure or systolic or diastolic values?
We need to measure all three. We need to measure all three. All three are systolic, diastolic, and mean arterial pressure is measured. Pulse pressure is not measured. All three have to be measured. Yes, it is important.
Okay, which is more reliable? Like all three are equally important.
Yeah, exactly. See, that's a question, the right question. See, we always see the trend. That's why I put the chart to mention what is the trend. If the systolic pressure is always increasing, then it should be a concern, and that is causing more of cardiac failure. Suppose the diastolic is more worsening, and that will also cause less blood to the heart, and that all myocardial dysfunction more. So mean arterial pressure, or we need to see all three, and the trending is important than one value of either systolic or MAP.
Thank you, sir. And the next question is again to Dr. Ishwar Raja. For how many days the gestational age correlates as the mean blood pressure in newborns?
Pardon me? What is the relationship of gestation?
The gestational age correlates as the mean blood pressure in newborns.
Yeah. You're asking for gestation age and blood pressure, isn't it?
Blood pressure in newborns, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So actually, the more premature, the more low the weight, there is a change. Vascular remodeling happens in utero due to stress or other causes. That is the reason. The more extreme prematurity or more low birth weight, they are risk of hypertension very high. Whereas the late preterms and term babies, the risk of getting hypertension is low. This is because of constant exposure to hypoxia, the vascular remodeling or antioxidant oxidant injury because of oxygen is play a very important role in maintaining the blood pressure.
Okay. There are a few other questions which is not actually relevant to this topic. Would you like to take up those questions, sir?
Yeah, tell me.
Like, do antenatal steroids influence skin maturation?
Yeah, I'll take up. Yes, it does. It does improve the maturation of skin. Dr. Mani can add upon this.
Yes, sir. Actually, the most important influence of antenatal steroids, of course, as I highlighted upon, is the change from the secretory to absorptive channel in the lungs. So such a similar effect is not very classically seen in the skin, but irrespective of the hormonal status, what decides the transepidermal water loss is the duration or postnatal day. So as I said earlier, on third day, irrespective of gestational age, be a 24-weeker baby or a 32-weeker baby, doesn't matter. On third day, the keratinization is near complete so that the insensible water loss reduces to a greater amount. So that is the single most important deciding factor rather than the hormonal influence. For respiratory water loss, we look more into other hormonal changes and adaptations and all. So that is very, very important as far as the respiratory insensible water loss is concerned. As far as the effect is very, very minimal, though there are some reports showing that the effect of steroids is actually reducing the extent to some extent, actually. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mani Kumar. I think it's again the same question. I think Dr. Shobna would like to answer it again. Do we have separate renal adjustable dosage according to neonatal creatinine clearance? Because physiologically only their creatinine clearance is low. Can we use the universal renal adjustment dosage for them as well?
Some of the drugs, if you use books like Teddy Bear, they have specific drug dosage based on the gestation age and the weight of the baby. For the nephrotoxic drugs, creatinine clearance keeps varying for each nephrotoxic drugs. So there is a standardized protocol for the creatinine clearance based on different drugs, whatever drugs you're using. So you should use that chart before deciding the dose for the neonates.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shobna. Next question is regarding ACE inhibitors.
Yes.
In neonates and nephrogenesis is not complete with low GFR. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's very much right. Yeah, it's very much right. We'll try to avoid. Yeah, we'll try to avoid the ACE inhibitors, at least for the initial stage. So sometimes we start with the labetalol or propranolol, and sometimes diuretics also help. So ACE inhibitors we try to avoid at least till 34, 36 weeks. And that is one more reason we need to be very careful while using drugs.
Okay, fine. Thank you, sir. I think next question is to Dr. Mani Kumar. How reliable is urine specific gravity in deciding fluid therapy and correlating serum sodium levels in neonates?
Yeah, that's a good question. Basically, we have to take into consideration all those factors. What I have decided upon as a clinician is that very easy for a clinician is to look at the weight of the baby and urine output of the baby. These are very handy, which are available all the time for a clinician. And lab values, we often take two things. One is the serum urine osmolarity or the specific gravity, and the serum sodium. So based on these, we try to get a holistic approach, not based on a particular value alone, basically. And especially the limitations of using that alone is that the concentrating as well as the diluting ability of a premature kidney is limited. So based on that, the specific gravity fluctuates, and also based upon the sugar values. And glycemic changes often happen very often in the first week of life, especially in a sick preterm baby, and that contributes to the osmolarities to some extent or specific gravity to some extent. You will often get glycosuria, which alters that, and we have to give allowance for it. So within all these limitations, we have to consider all those things. Not as a single value, definitely for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mani Kumar. The next question is how reliable is fractional excretion of urea in newborns?
Fractional excretion of urea in newborns.
No.
I think Kale would be a better person to answer that. So fractional excretion of urea is not something we use. Fractional excretion of sodium is something we take into consideration. But urea, I may not be the right person to answer. We don't use that.
Yeah, on routine, regular basis, we never use fractional excretion of urea on regular basis. I think it doesn't conclude anything, like even if we do. The next question, I think we are done with the questions. Ishwar sir, do you have any questions to be asked?
It was a great presentation. All three went on very well. And I think I'm done.
Fine. So I think we are very much on time today. We have got one more question to add on.
Yeah.
From where should we take reference ranges of blood pressure for newborns? Is there any specific chart to be made?
Yeah. First 2 weeks we use Zubro's chart, and after the 2 weeks Dionin chart. And recently our Indian data has come, we can use that also. So since these two charts have been used for a long time and almost all the NICU use this, so we are using it. The recent Indian data, it's come up very well. We are trying to incorporate into the regular use.
Okay. There is one more question, but it is out of the topic. It's on how common is pulmonary hypertension in newborns?
Pardon me?
Like how common is pulmonary hypertension in newborns?
Yeah. That is more common and much more common than the systemic hypertension. because these babies have been born, they are having by default pulmonary hypertension. The right sided pressure is more than the left side. So, and if it persists, it has to, the pulmonary pressure has to reduce. If it persists, it's called pulmonary PPHN, and that is for varied reason. One is mechanism aspiration and congenital diaphragm. There are varied reasons for this. So, more than systemic hypertension, pulmonary hypertension is very common. Yes, we do see. And pulmonary hypertension is really, it's a real nightmare.
And the next question, like I think there is just a comment for the previous question, the fractional excretion of urea. That is what has been already diagnosed. All the newborn tubules or immature, like so the fractional excretion of many things is not reliable. And the fractional excretion of urea helps in differentiating between SIADH and cerebral salt wasting, but not much of use in neonatology. The next question is, it's just a comment from a request to Dr. Ishwar Raja. Can you please repeat the names of the charts used for day 1?
Yeah, day 1, Zubro's chart. I'll show, it is then Zubro's chart, ZUBUR.
Okay. I think we'll end up this session. I think we are done with the questions as well. Hope there are no more questions in the box. Thank you so much. We had an excellent presentation, everything covering on neonatal nephrology, from fluids to estimation of GFR to neonatal hypertension. Thank you for the lucid talk. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Shobna. Thank you, Dr. Ishwar Raja. Thank you, Dr. Mani Kumar. The next 2 webinars will be completely on neonatal nephrology, and all neonatologists can participate in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kalai, for that excellent organization. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Bye.
It was a great job. Keep going.
Thank you so much, sir. Bye. Bye, sir. Bye, Shobna.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, sir.
Bye.
Bye, Dr. Manikumar, sir.
Bye. Bye, sir.